Hello everyone, today we talk about the Sarmatians and the Maeotians, with a brief look also at their Hellenic neighbor in this de facto Scytho-Hellenic context, and more specifically of their warfare, as we have started essentially epitomizing a bit these phases of especially Western Eurasian steppes warfare that I plan to go on with until the even the late modern age, given that I've seen that you particularly appreciate at least this kind of topics. They get algorithmic very fast, but they're also very fascinating. They're on the list, as I already explained countless times. I cover basically everything in detail as far as army organization, tactics, units, battles, etc. These are just introductions that I hope can guide for those cases in which I haven't discussed these topics more in depth, definitely as a prelude to that, but also for someone that maybe comes across one of the most specialistic content, let's say, that I've made, for maybe getting kind of a general background, whatever. Concentrating on warfare, naturally we look at the essence of these peoples to get down properly to the concrete side of the story, in the art of war, and also what their lifestyle really was, what their mindset was about, from what we can reconstruct naturally. We have pointed out the harsh brutality of the steppes world, that however is a world in evolution, right? We will observe, hopefully thanks to this series, that aligned for essentially the entire pre-industrial times, the steppes have been fundamentally a nomadic space as far as the communities that inhabited them were concerned. Also, when they were brought under the the control of sedentary neighbors, the landscape, the lifestyle, the same tactics and strategies did change, did evolve to a consistent degree. We began with the Rartans, the Transcaucasians, the Cimmerians. We have seen how, of course, aside from the relative overlapping, especially with the Central Asian peoples that gradually moved westwards to, in fact, make us indicate this kind of waves, this different phases of a system, of a mechanism that was pretty much the same at the end of the day. The steppes world populated itself, so the affirmation of more powerful, more cohesive confederacies. Then there were moments of shattering of this order. There is, as you know, in early medieval times, this fundamentally, in fact, paradigm shift from a bit like the Indo-European to the Turco-Mongolian steppe, where naturally most of the people we look at were, in spite of their nomadism, very much connected with the previous inhabitants. That just originally were obviously sedentary at a point, and that always not just ruled over sedentary peoples in the steppes, that varied in terms of, in fact, level of development, even not just in time, but in place. But they also sanitarized partly, right? So obviously the myth of the barbarian that shoots arrows from horseback, with this kind of tricky shots from, while retreating and so on, is always there. But naturally, when we focus on their warfare, we realize that, for example, dismounting, or also just generally speaking, infantries, especially from the subjected peoples, were there, and they were part of an important mechanism, especially as far as, for example, think about trade, arms and armor production for essentially warlike peoples and so on. So there had to be a stability that, in the same steps, that these peoples were looking forward to, in a way, but naturally had quite unstable conditions to try to maintain, given that, again, the steppes movements, the one of nomadic peoples, are always, if anything, perturbed by these new waves, right, of wilder, more violent people from a bit like the springs of nomadism, that very often were the ones of, because of that insane instability of some of these military developments over time, against some nomads or semi-nomads that had settled in the West and that had gradually softened up, gentrified, in some cases properly settled down, sedentarily speaking, or however towards that direction. This is quite evident. We have seen it often. I made some videos already, as you know, about the Scythians, the Sarmatians, that, as was recalling before, are also, some of the most watched. And we have observed that, in fact, it's not just a matter of tactics or armaments, but sometimes it's just properly what was expected, humanly speaking, from these individuals, right? The idea, for example, that whenever these peoples obtain kind of greater wealth, control on pastures and trade posts and so on, they tended to somehow, first of all, lose a bit like the social balance. The average warrior would become, a subject under the most powerful groups, contributing also to that weakening, right? Because essentially, if you wanted to remain at least in the steppes in that fashion, and there were also quite environmental problems in that regard, you would this stabilization, at least in a certain geographical area, would normally bring to some kind of weakening of the entire nomadic system. Maybe the concentration or surplus in an elite was ultra elite, but with the rest of the people that were nothing more on average than horse archers, literally because they didn't have even armor at that point. Whereas in the steppes, especially in the cauldron of Central Asia, what you actually really look at is the even the still compact hybrid synthesis between the shock knight, let's say with the Contos, for example, double-handed grip, and somehow a cataphract outlook, at least in the case of the elite. But the archer at the same time, right? This is something that, for example, you observe also in the Parthian armies and the Sasanian ones over time, that the more centralized they became, and the more they distinguish the two roles, tactically speaking, because it required an enormous effort that just the individualism of the individualism, let's say, of the steppe, as in terms of like you can't stabilize more than much, so you have to rely more on individuals in that help rather than on collective discipline, which is also the big limit of the steppes that really would never manage to essentially control any sedentary reality on the road. They could at best rate them, it could at best maybe even substitute the elites at some point or marry into them, but never quite transplanting this system somewhere else. They were just boxed in the steppes. This is actually the problem with that. It was a sort of ghetto area that produced such fierce warlike populations because they didn't have objectively any other mean to survive, but carrying out this extremely violent lifestyle based on the systematic instability that required that degree of combativeness and etc. Now, this is observable, for example, between the Sarmatians and the Scythians, right? Stereotypically, even though, again, we're talking just about the thing. I mean, the idea of having a cavalry of skirmishers, of javeliners, to say, as opposed to the ancient, older, tough, even just humble Central Asian horse archers is overrun by the Sarmatians that used a much more, close-knit kind of heavy light cavalry interaction, and also had a much greater punching power, also because of technology that does advance in the steppes, right? Armor getting heavier, also more available, because again there is a minimal compaction of power. Then you have again the degree of surplus even still in balanced systems, and then think about the stirrups on the longer run, and things that must never confuse with kind of the deal, right? Say what actually changed warfare. Stirrups at large didn't change warfare at all, right? Many people think they did, but they were actually just created for a warfare that had already changed, and then political and social preconditions that simply had not existed before. But again, we live in a modernistic technologism, and trying to explain a bit of the history of technology or economics in the essentials sometimes is really very, very, very hard with the average person. In any case, the Scythians, especially, we will see the Greeks, as we've seen of the Bosphorus, Sumerian Bosphorus, the Maeotians, that have a bit more of a sanitary flavor to an otherwise Scythian kingship, right? But the Scythians are really something brutal in classical times. They became a bit the symbol of the barbarian, of the wild raider, of the, again, extremely ferocious individual, even just for their practice, their cults, and so on, right? And again, we look, I stated that also in the previous video, because every time I make these videos, there is somebody that feels entitled to come to a point and say, try to make you lessons about how the steps really were, how everything is approximated. Yes, but, talking about how half empty or half full a glass is not a scientific conversation, right? And I think that, modestly, I know a thing or two maybe about these populations that you may just want to listen to before coming with that kind of condescendence to somebody that has, okay, at least some have seen something. I will not specify that, but in general, again, the perspective we're looking at here and why we categorize these peoples as such naturally is a matter of historiographical convention. And it's not entirely wrong, right? You know that I'm a great fan of written records because there is an entire good half of Western scholarship that, aside having started to collapse since the 1970s, basically presumed that, everything that was written tradition was wrong, was inaccurate. I've been studying now for a long time from that background that some of you knows and that I don't need to repeat, a bit of written historiographical tradition, and I've never actually found like a macroscopic, like this thing is complete fantasy, and or even if it was, just why was it in that exceptional and confined space, and what was it actually doing, contextually speaking. And people don't like, again, usually that, there is this mentality that, first of all, the death of expertise, which is in part true, but the other one is that anybody can say anything, just because, again, you can make the point of the half full and half empty glass. That's, again, a stupid point to make in general, right? When you describe certain peoples and you are also within that kind of, say, the boundary, within the boundaries of historiographical awareness, like if you talk about peoples like the Scythians and you say things like this were Indo-European, and then there are other groups with other names, more or less this geographical distribution, this other ethnicity, you're not really saying that if you go back 2,500 years ago and you stop a cavalryman in the midst of the steppes, if you're lucky enough not to, get scalped in the process, this guy takes out a passport that says, oh, I'm a Scythian, I just, this is my identity, this is the thing, and it's obvious that when we use these empirical names to identify what is, however, still doesn't matter how approximately in the boundaries, but a massive political, moral, military, and cultural force at some time in history that is witnessed and has been historiographically categorized for a reason. That, again, this is, you can look at that comma and say, but this wasn't quite like that. Well, it's, again, this is at best somebody that my students do in the first year, or maybe the second, of university. Then adults normally move on, right? And they do because they, at that point, they're sufficiently educated to understand why we use these definitions. And again, I do understand a bit like the mentality of people in the first half of their 20s. Again, this is not something that historians really care about, because they are very well aware of, and it leads nowhere, and they don't need to make up things to, come up with these conventional terms, but simply speaking to a person what the ABC of history really is. Now, this is, again, extremely important, and it's a bit like what divides, again, the reliable from the unreliable, generally speaking. Then I have, again, had in the past, you have no idea sometimes of what happens when I publish these videos, because there is some sort of general malaise from one side, like as far as the sense of, you're talking about these people as if there was somebody out there that was, treasuring the hardcore knowledge at some spring of these ethnicities that you cannot say the word. If you don't even get these things, like, there may be something severely wrong with these behaviors, right? And also without that, for that matter, but in general, like, the link there is evident. These are not picked as historical topics. They're basically taken by paranoid individuals who just have maybe hyper-focused without any background on a given topic, given people, given culture, and not just they don't know anything else, but consequently they can't even properly understand what that thing is, even after several years, because again, they do not have a term of comparison. They can't believe anything. This I get through, I admit it was a bit worse in the past years. Maybe now YouTube is different, or maybe I selected a good enough pool of, let's say, of followers. But the thing is still widespread, and especially I think that the reason why it decreased at best is because kids do not even approach these topics anymore. History has completely flown out of the window entirely for, in a sense, to stop also, not to stop the pain of these individuals, but at least for us to be listening to them. But I don't think I have to explain further at this point for those that I presume are capable of understanding this content. In any case, and always remember that everything is more nuanced anyway, and it's just building those details that you actually consolidate pretty consistent definition, pretty consistent identities. Because again, history is all like that. There is a phase in which you're told things were in a way, then you start discovering, saying, oh my god, but we're kind of different, there were shades. Then you understand the actual deal. You realize that, yes, there are shades at the outskirts, but then the core is even stronger than you thought it was at the beginning, and so you go with that, right? Introducing the Scythians is a huge enterprise, because I plan to make multiple videos, actually, on this topic in the various phases of their millenary history. In any case, it's important to start from Herodotus in general. So the father of history, this great historical figure, as a great historian of antiquity, and the beginner, at least, of the type of Western history that we consider to any historiography, as we consider it canonically, by method, by approach, by mentality, by genre, to have existed. The peoples that inhabited southeastern Europe came consistently in his radar to describe, and among them we know best of all, definitely, and owing to archaeological record, artifacts, descriptions, and linguistic data, the Iranian-speaking Scythians, the Adeg-speaking Maeotians that we mentioned partly also in the previous video, and the say in the Kuban region, so more or less say between the Caucasus and the Kerch Strait, and the Greeks, naturally, that not just because Herodotus was one of them, but because of their specific role at that point in the history of civilization, and a bit also the bridging one existing, not just in the Aegean, but also in the Black Sea, right, and in the colonization of the Bosphorus, and the direct acquaintance also in arms with these Iranian-speaking populations. As we've seen, these had originated essentially from Central Asia. They had taken over the Cimmerians that were Iranians themselves, but that are considered separated from the Scythians, historiographically speaking, and by whom, in fact, were again overrun, right, bringing to this new stage of kind of the development in the Pontic steppe. The most important contacts, let's say, between the Greeks and the Scythians had come these northern shores of the Black Sea during the 7th century, right? So only shortly before Herodotus' time, but definitely there were some, older continuities with this. There were also the Maeotians in the picture for the fact that these people were substantially autochthonous by a degree of the Kuban area, right, by at least an older time than the Pontic area, generally speaking, was for the Scythians. They had stemmed, the Maeotians had stemmed from, again, middlemen of civilization, in part nomadic, in part sedentaries, that had been important, especially for the traffics between Caucasus, the Middle East, and the Pontic steppe in Cimmerian times, so much that they had been providing and producing just by themselves an important degree of arms and armor to the most updated kind of late Bronze and beginning of the Iron Age time. The Cimmerians, as we've seen, were quite impressive warriors. They were the ones who probably began to raid consistently the Middle East, Anatolia, by coalescing substantial forces of mounted troops, mostly horse archers, but also shock forces. This was new at the time, because that more or less the civilized world revolved around chariot warfare that had come actually from the same Indo-Europeans of the steppes, of the Andronovo culture, etc., but that hadn't developed up to that point cavalry as a prevalent arm over the chariot. As a matter of fact, we'll talk about the history of horsemanship in that regard, as far as especially the art of war proper is concerned, because there is no doubt that peoples like the Cimmerians rose also because as a consequence of the collapse a bit of the Bronze Age civilizations, and or at least the crisis of some major powers in the area. The fact that Iranians like the Maids and then the Achaemenids, etc., were also like the ones who would substitute themselves, at least as rulers, to the Assyrian Empire, that had been basically the strongest military in the world at that point, shows that there had been something in the Iranian steppes as far as, again, the political compassion, just the development of cavalry potential was due to some broader compaction of these groups, and their strengthening. It was a double thread relation, again, as long as they could plunder and carry out this incredibly long-ranging raids, right, with their logistics, with their strategy. Well, surely there is a sort of shift, right? Like the sea peoples with their infantries. They were also technically connected in part with, if not properly the springs of nomadism, but still with that kind of Indo-European background that was pushing towards the West fundamentally, and really opening another phase in the history of the art of war. You realize how the at least the ratio strength involved is still worth considering, because nobody here had kind of the jolly card, right? Nobody had a system that was intrinsically, at least from a tactical point of view, the winning one, right? Actually, from a general point of view, the steps, as we were saying before, remained always at margin of civilizational development, right? But there is no doubt that there were deep intersections, in that, of course, the development of cavalry passed through a substantial amount also of Iranian injection, pretty much everywhere in the Caucasus, in the Iranian plateau, in fact, in Anatolia, and even in Europe, right? And you cannot quite distinguish sometimes who was who genetically speaking, when you read these accounts about various, war bands roaming around, and just even the tactical specialties are somehow, tricky, and for this time in history, not described in dramatic detail, at least before figures like Herodotus started coming around. Now, the culture of the Scythians was very much akin to that of the Maeotians, as we've seen before. But the latter were engaged in sedentary cattle breeding and farming, right? The former were mostly nomads instead, right? Again, this is the case of the half empty or full glass, right? Is it important to kind of repeat again that obviously there was a bit of both from both sides? It's just, this was the general outlook that we get from sources, from historiography, from archaeology. Obviously not, right? The reasons why that this would be the case naturally depended also on some data, and maybe you can collect and look in another video, such as how much, the same climate sometimes, which is not really determinate per se, but obviously think about the Caucasus in general and the rich, productive, fertile lands of the north. They're the mix of civilizational influence, right? And the fact, again, that most of these nomads really wanted just to settle down at some point as to enjoy the fruit of their conquest would bring gradually certain areas to be ever more influenced by sort of sedentary lifestyle. Naturally, new waves of peoples would at some point even disrupt the sedentary achievements. This is kind of evident in many areas, but it's obvious that the steps, just for some specific characteristics, doesn't allow or doesn't render convenient in the first place, because everything is technically possible, but another lifestyle than the nomadic one. Also, if you really wanted to have a shot there, this cattle breeding is independent from the degree of sedentarism or not was necessary to the development of a shock cavalry, which is something that you really can't do without if you are just out there in the middle of the steppes, and you're just surrounded by enemies without any kind of major natural border or that you can exploit, or local resources where you can fundamentally accumulate enough surplus to defend yourself from these people. There were, again, sedentary communities scattered all over, and their infantries were surprisingly tough considering the average gear, which was somehow very simple, just a shield and a spear most of the time. Armor was not really that common, but they did manage to put impressive put up impressive stance against heavy cavalry, because in the essentials, if you have a motivated community of infantrymen, of people that maybe just knew how to fight on horse pretty well, and that can at some point dismount and form a wall of shields with all spears sticking out of that, right? Like that's quite a tough thing to break on average for a nomad, right? And when you look again at the civilizations from say at the outskirts of the steppes, they mostly developed those tactics themselves to compensate for the lack of all that kind of horsemanship, at least provided in such large amounts with such kind of original lifestyle, with a lot of missile forces as well. Right, this is typical. We'll see it hopefully if the series progresses with Slavs, with the first, those who were in the first rank, let's say, against the steppes peoples, and that on the longer run actually got the upper hand on them too. Right, the Maeotians were particularly important for the Scythian culture because they somehow bridged it with the one of the Near and Middle East. Their land was essentially the road that the Scythians took. Also, naturally, co-opting, right? And, the volunteers, put it this way, in their expeditions. In fact, the locals. And they helped in this sense as, again, middlemen of civilization in shaping, during the mid-7th century BC, the same nature of the Scythian campaigns towards the south, where the riches were. And this brought the Scythians to acquire, financially more quickly, equipment such as scaly metal armor, a cast metal helmet, and a ceremonial and defensive horse bridle that truly had been around from a while. The Cimmerians, as we've seen, were provided with them, but the Scythians were wilder, at least as soon as they settled. They just took advantage of what they found there, but they, through their expeditions, increased the imports, the production of these gear, to strengthen essentially the effectiveness of their cavalry. The Scythians at some point were defeated during their expeditions, but this somehow made them grow over time. They were routed by the Maids, for example, at some point, and they would stream back in that circumstance to their bases in the Kuban area, where they had played a decisive role themselves, by the way, in the genesis, at least, of what we call the early Maeotian culture, right? Because the Maeotians also come to be known fundamentally in this context as something different from the previous peoples, especially the slightly more sedentarized ones that had occupied the same area, but that had maintained that function, and in part, in fact, sedentarized the same part of these same Iranian nomads, right? Again, as far as the identities are concerned, you would probably be amazed by how they actually reason, and we do rely definitely on ethnographic approximations of the classical authors that, however, are still substantially insightful about the essentials of these greater people. Actually, they do make us a favor, in as much as probably if these Scythians and had just left us kind of a history of their own, they would probably be less attentive to consider themselves as a whole separated from others. They would probably also look more at the origins, at the divisions, in the land they had conquered. Not that they lacked some degree of collective awareness about themselves. It's a bit like I made this video similarly for the Germans, right? But like in that case, you have to await the 6th century before you find somebody ethnically identifiable as a German to call himself a German, and still in ways that were still fundamentally modulated by a classical ethnographic canon, right? That in part we think they adopted themselves. In fact, as I was saying in the video about the Sarmatians, the story of the Amazons, of the maidens collecting heads in order to be able to consume their marriage and all this stuff, it was something that probably the same Sarmatians were quite amused by, and they kind of somehow expanded a bit as a half truth, right? As far as also the cultural impact of the Hellenic mythology, Hellenic literature at that point was conditioning them, like, right? So be always aware of the fact that what we can see, even just as an archaeological artifact, as a scene depicting a war, etc., is and how that is very similar, naturally, to the art even of those peoples that were essentially imitating it, right? Because they just, if they had to, right, to reproduce the same, more or less the same pictures, would do it for reasons that evidently weren't quite just the ones for which they would habitually represent anything. These peoples were so brutal that they rejected, like, it's just like, I don't know, the Romans in the 3rd century BC, before the Punic Wars, thought that legitimately you could not be a man and a man of letters, in fact, at the same time. Because a true Roman is just a warrior and just fights and acts and doesn't sit there contemplating, right? So you can imagine a Scythian of the 7th century BC, what would have thought about that? And the paradigm is really universal. Surely, there was really no other. It would have been even partly insulting their own culture to pretend they would have to do things like writing or live as something more, record-based than what they used to do. But again, it's very fortunate for us to have had their peoples that already had an historiographical tradition capable of describing the Scythians in this case at that point in history. Again, and this is very unique to Western history to the degree, because even with China, we have much less insightful, critical, and somehow detailed records. Sometimes we even have less of them. Actually, you know what I think about communist China in the first place, and the abortion of dignity of mankind that represents, and what they sadly did, not just to people but to history, which to a degree I think is even more important than human life. But the idea again is we have an incredible privilege of having such a, if you want, also diversified stage development areas, climates, etc., so as to stimulate that kind of criticism, which is a bit the reason why we are children of the Greeks in that sense, because they straddle at the time again of the Aegean Sea. They lived in both sides. They were also in the Black Sea, so they really saw lots of different peoples, and they also understood themselves being unique to the degree of having this somehow common criterion of evaluation that does turn out to be also for the first time historically specifically objective, right? Also in terms of categories, etc. It does distance itself for the more traditional view, like a Persian would have thought, I don't know, that there is no such thing like trees as a category. They would think that tree is that tree only. And if you think about that, is actually correct from a scientific point of view. But in terms of what you have to do with that knowledge, the Greeks were the ones that began to appreciate that degree of, let's say, of of categorization, that still, however, was aware and could have not happened otherwise of that need of transcendence that may have been behind what does make a tree rather than categorizing it. Just that we are the categorists, really, especially from the Enlightenment. That was something very different from what Greeks really were doing, describing these peoples. So you hear the Scythians kind of introducing a bit their what we see often, even just stereotypically in the finds, etc. Scaly metal armor, cast metal helmets, etc. So in a world where this stuff was just becoming more common, material culture was kind of becoming wealthier a bit everywhere, but that was still a big deal, right, for the Pontic steppe, right, showing how hierarchical in nature also the Scythian the Scythians in general were becoming, right, politically speaking, so with an enhanced military capacity, strategic projection, and so on, right. From this wider area, so mostly, say the richest places, the most advanced ones, as we've seen, were in Mesopotamia. So the Scythians mostly took that direction, as we've seen with the Maeotians, also in between, having great contacts with the Caucasus, and considering from the east, having lots of other Iranian elements being injected in the game and coming also from other directions, but in this case from the north, marching around the northern Caspian Sea, sometimes also passing between the Iranian plateau and the Caspian Sea itself, with that corridor over Kenya, etc. But again, we will talk about these things eventually in detail. As you understand, they're very big areas, and lots of things were actually going on there. From the Pontic steppe, by the way, the Scythians also expanded west, right? To places as far as the Danube. We can't even say technically which the limit was. We know, of course, have an idea where more or less the Scythians were never heard of, but aside from single groups that may have settled actually pretty far west, right? I wouldn't be surprised we were talking about Gaul or Spain or whatever. But the steppes area, right? What begins properly in Central Europe, in specific areas, may have seen the settlement of a consistent amount of Scythians influencing local warfare. It's, again, difficult even to trace here like a distinction. You know that there is an hypothesis regarding the Cimmerian origin having to do with the Thracians, right? Not eventually the ones that just we know better, having settled on the right bank of the Danube, and especially the northern ones maintaining actually a pretty solid mounted warfare lifestyle. But in general, from wherever these groups had arrived as Indo-Europeans in the Balkans and beyond, for us to say, well, these are Thracians, these are Scythians, but again, it were somehow similar. Of course, there was a lot of mix. Then, Thracia was fundamentally a sanitary country. There had been, other cultures inhabiting there from quite a long time, with substantially different characters than the one of the Pontic steppe, right? But this was wide enough to show us how many Scythians were in the first place, right? They would have stretched to the Danube, in fact, and to the latitude of Kiev to the north, and established the three Scythian kingdoms. They are so-called three Scythian kingdoms. The population of these realms consisted essentially of the royal house, then the men-at-arms, a stratum, let's say, and the free commoners, plus lots of other serfs, were not slaves, right? The concept behind this being, again, in the steppes you have mostly this hardcore that manages to punch hard its way through, because normally it's the result of lots of others being taken out in the enterprise, because if it hadn't been them, it would have been someone else. And this hardcore nucleus gathers lots of people that fundamentally rely on the success of these leaders to just receive, participating for sharing the loot, let's say, participating in the expeditions in that regard, and kind of maintaining the concept of highness of a certain specific clan, people, dynasty, even at some point. At least, meant in this, among the Scythians, things were very horizontal in terms of also political below. But this social certification is meaningful, right? Because the men-at-arms would be somehow the royal house were thought, and that's the measure of the dynastic outlook. By, again, it's all debatable in the degree of, but the idea of sacrality, right? According to the Indo-European royal concept, probably, of the leader that is also priest, that is also warrior, of course, and that truly is the point of contact between God and earth. Then the men-at-arms that are basically the professional retinue of the kings, right? And these people would make fortune, or if they wouldn't die young, as it often happened in the process, by the way, by being provided with, especially during the settlement in the Pontic steppe, with a large amount of territory to cover, right? They had their own pasture area. They would have their kind of preferred, in fact, residences scattered all around. They would be settled at the head of large amounts of warriors that had fundamentally just to follow them in turn, and they would make up the heavy cavalry of the Scythian hosts. The free commoners were those Scythians that, having taken part to these broader movements, were considered, because of cultural or ethnic affinity, as having earned a degree of freedom that could not be hampered, and that or treaded on, while the rest of the population, that admittedly was not enormous in the steppe, but still, again, as we've seen, did exist, and that could simply be part of these clans as nomads themselves. If there were serfs, again, imagine, surely was plenty of Cimmerians, right? Or at least, a common practice in the steppe was slaughtering the men and raping the women to make them their wives, and, this sense, taking literally the blood of your enemy to continue your race, which was a huge deal. So the steppes are also pretty impressively efficient as far as these dynamics happen. So there wouldn't be much space for other kind of random peasants around. But these did exist too, by a degree, as we've seen, and they would contribute. They would live at the outskirts of this world too, and would also be mobilized at some point as infantry forces, for example. Think about the relation with the Proto-Slavs, by a degree, just the necessity for these Scythians that did try to storm cities at some point. They had some technical capacity. They weren't just merely nomadic barbarians to court. They would be obliged to become that, right? And they would surely even hire, we've seen, they would be allies with Scytho-Hellenic polities. They would hire, hoplitic mercenaries at some point. It will also, of course, acquire hoplitic panoplies, right? Given that Greece at this point was the most exporting and productive and advanced arms and armor market, right here. So the Scythians were partly surely captured by ravished by the softness of the Mediterranean civilization, which the Sarmatians later on would take advantage of, just like the thing had occurred for the Cimmerians. Needless to say, Scythian society was highly militarized. Right, it was a world where you wouldn't know any other business but the one of war. Concretely, again, you would have retinues who take care of other elements, trade, etc. But things fundamentally flowed smoothly as long as you could maintain that political cohesion necessary to also exercise a deterrence on whoever would try, even just to interfere in your territory, to have something to say about the caravans, the kind of the some other resources that were surely collected from grain, even to precious metals, and exported from Scythia, right? The military lifestyle of the Scythians entailed, again, an incredibly brutal background, a lifetime spent on horseback, an incredibly unmodern and unsecularized vision of the world, naturally a deep connection with especially the animals, right? And then the land was not conceived as so particularly important. They would understand how much resources could be derived from it, but their attention was towards heaven, towards the sky, right? There are interesting chthonic characteristics in Iranian cultures, even at the stage of of nomadism. But generally speaking, for them, moving was not a big deal, right? They were completely, their land was, let's say, their fixed point was their community that could travel, could move away. The Achaemenids would invade Scythia at the point. The Scythians carry out just scorched earth strategy, and eventually tried. They confronted the Persian army also in open field when it was softened up. But sometimes it was probably not necessary, right? Considering how quick they could achieve without really not losing much, right? They would move with all their horses, their cattle, and even though, of course, these movements were problematic as far as which other groups these would touch and how many other space they would have, and how much could the enemies take advantage of this withdrawal. Normally things would come back the same way, also because sedentary civilizations weren't to stay in the steppes. They didn't have technically any mean or interest for it. They would just want to break the backbone of these polities, right? So another aspect of the Scythians is, you can see even from the pictures I uploaded here, is that they were quite beefy, right? The Cimmerians were recorded, and this is something gets down to even modern languages like the Georgian one, as the giants, right? And if you look at the Scythians, then they were beefy, right? They were big, they were bulky, tough, sturdy, strong, and this was naturally a consequence of a degree of natural selection in those circumstances. They would naturally have their own artificial selection, just like this was normal also in Greece or in Rome. They were much more just ahead in that sense. But taking out the weak babies, for example, just exposing them in a way to let nature select them, they would constantly again fight. So the stronger you were, the more successful, generally speaking, you would be. We're not in an age which never existed technically, which just was the individual that counted more than the collectivity. The Scythians were very good at their collective tactics and the way of organizing and self-coordinating their cavalry forces, hit-and-run tactics. To an important scale, and so on. But generally speaking, physical prowess was a bit the reflection of how much it cost to live in the steppes themselves, and how, as we were saying before, much these peoples were just confined to the steppes. compared to what they would have liked to put their hands on. Just some little and cute detail from how the Scythians acquired their fame and notoriety: drinking the blood of their enemies, using their scalps for towels and the skin of their hands for quivers. Now, was this true? Yes, right, and not just this, right? You see, a people that lives like this, like it just does everything more or less in this kind of fashion. Of course, we can imagine some degree of more civil interaction between the Scythians, even in moments of conflict, etc. But even if this hadn't been useful just for the Scythians to maintain their name of people with whom you didn't have to mess up, still, this was pretty much functional again to asserting their own, in fact, dominion, even just in domestic policy, right? I really have never understood how can someone accuse the Mediterranean civilizations of having spread kind of negative bias against the wild peoples of the barbaric, right? That we know pretty well, also just from archaeological, what actually happened there, right? We know well how much these peoples were actually proud of showing the Senatories, by the way, what they did, say, on common enemies, like they were politically divided, and of course the Senatories interfered with their policy to the point that they would back. This happened all the time. We've seen it also with the Sarmatians. They are tied constantly in their internal feuds, and this was also a problem because, again, given that you can't quite control the steppes, you can't even really simply get there and get it over with, all this mess, right? So, not just classical accounts are reliable, but they also fit with the general and regular violence of these populations. I mean, what kind of consideration can you have for human life if you live, again, constantly in a militarized system where basically the entire deal is carrying out raids on enemy territories, plundering, massacring, enslaving, and just profiting from that, right? And what's technically even wrong with that, right? Of course, it's a limit of your culture because you can't do better, right? The other civilizations did the same exact things, except they did also a lot more to that. These people did essentially only this, and that's the measure of a civilizational development. This is also very difficult to actually appreciate in many ways. Like, I don't know, head hunting. Sometimes it was also a big deal as far as giving a decent funeral to people whose body, just in an expedition, in a skirmish, etc., you could not salvage or carry with you. You simply sever their head, also of your friends, to preserve them. And this, you would do the same with the enemies again, but for other purpose, including drinking from their skulls, because they thought that really the power of a person lays in the hand, and so drinking by the skull of an enemy, which is not a slave, right? Nobody would drink from the head of a slave, because slaves are lesser people, and they don't count even as human beings. You want to drink from the skull of a great leader and getting all the power that is contained there. And for them, again, it was somehow normal. These things happen for also a very long time, not just in the steppes, by the way, and are pretty, universal anthropological beliefs and notions and kind of acknowledgments throughout basically all history at that level, at that stage of development. As we have said, the Scythians were also physically tough, because spending a lifetime on horseback requires that constant physical fitness, It requires an incredible resistance just to the weather, to properly physical strains. They trained for war continuously, right? The Scythians were especially renowned and feared as matchless mounted archers, and that craft takes years to perfect, right? Again, knowing what's the instant in which the horse raises all and four the hooves from the ground to just shoot, and not having any other vibration, like the horse coming back on the ground to ruin your accuracy, your precision, is really something you feel in your guts at some point, having spent your entire life since you were a kid, fundamentally, on horseback. Let's say mounted archery was also a way, as we've seen, to just prepare the enemy to the intervention of the shock forces, right? They were the ones who were to properly design the engagements normally, right? Sometimes there was so much arrow fire everywhere that entire armies could simply decide to retreat even before a decisive engagement if they were losing too much. It must have been dramatically attritional in terms of organics, of logistics, of just even unity, right? All these groups you had to put together to maintain an army during a campaign, right? So if something started to tilt during an engagement, like in your to your detriment, naturally things would escalate quickly just to salvage as many forces you could, right? It's also very complicated to handle yourself here. It's very complicated to know when to launch a cavalry charge. Mostly cavalry was very impressive already at this time in the steppes, also because of the degree of armoredness. Very often this armoredness stemmed from from defensive necessities. Of course, the heavier you were and the tougher the beast you had, you rode, in a sense also you had to be, of course. But so the greater the shock, yeah, right. But generally speaking, much of that defense is also designed for just being in a constant hail of arrows and hoping to get out of there alive. This is nothing compared to what you see in other history, say, of warfare circumstances, like even the crossbow or longbow hail of arrows of the late Middle Ages are nothing in comparison to the sheer amount of arrows could be shot, right, in the steppes normally by these nomadic armies, and their splinter. It's not even, again, armor was fundamentally adequate, at least the one of the elite. The others went unarmored, also because mostly they fought in packs, and the best defense there was, shooting as much as you could effectively together with others, right? That would simply reduce, hopefully enough, the time to determine a lower likelihood to be hit, right? And that's why these troops were that light, because they wouldn't engage into hand-to-hand combat normally, at least not preferably. They knew how to do that, but they weren't counted on for it during major engagements in the first place, and the main problem mostly came from sedentary peoples that, as we've seen, were aware, especially in these steppes and especially in the Hellenic colonies of the Taurica, how armored, how heavy they had to be adequately defended by the not just the enemy arrows, but also the enemy cavalry charges. That at that point, like, imagine you have been fighting in the steppes all the time, you find finally a bulky infantry unit that basically sits there, and that you can finally charge straight with all your force. Consider that there is not such thing out there, like, I don't know, artillery, machine guns, whatever. So these like an hoplitic phalanx or a Scythian horde were pretty much the strongest thing you could find out there at the time, and they were pretty aware of this peak reached by their capacities and tried to attrition each other accordingly, and developing, mutuating, becoming hybrid from one another, also technologically. The Scythians also used the rain of short arrows with bronze heads. They were loose from small composite resilient bows. It was the typical archer gear armament of the Scythian. Well, first of all, the enemy's fighting spirit. Right? It's extremely frustrating to be under these arrows showers, because again, you can't really do much against them. Right? If you abandon the formation, you're going to be cut down more easily, surrounded, whatever. You put the entire system at risk. But these peoples are so cunning in as much as they will not basically launch their elite till the very last. So spending an incredible amount of arrows just to wear you out, not causing practically any decisive loss, physically speaking, because very few people would have gotten killed among, say, an hoplitic phalanx while under Scythian fire. But it would unnerve them, it would break their spirit, it would essentially make them become almost crazy. Right, and that's what the Scythians really counted on. Because, by the way, it's about the adrenaline, it's about your self-consumption. When you see all these packs of horse archers jumping around, raising great clouds of dust, etc., you don't even know essentially what's going on. Right? You don't know whether behind the dust there is maybe a shock element that is coming there to charge you, and that is one of the single most radically traumatic events that can happen to you on a battlefield, even more than shelling, as a matter of fact, because you can't quite, especially considering how packed the formations really were up to the end of the 19th century. Really, you are going to be cut down like grass if your formation starts melting away. And the guys there are on horseback. You have a heavy armor, or at least you're on foot, even if you threw away your gear, etc. These guys are going to hunt you down. And they were pretty damn efficient in that. They knew all the terrain, they knew how to survive in very uncomfortable positions. You were probably a good fighter in your own degree. The Scytho-Hellenic troops were also probably less amateurish than, let's say, the one of the Hellenic motherland per se. But you're a guy that counts on coming back home to a hut, to a farm somewhere, just resting, and you don't have the stamina, you don't have the resilience, the patience, the unmitigated and traumatic brutality of a Scythian that can easily eat you alive in case of need, right? And that's the end that awaits you, and you know that, and that plays an important role on the battlefield, right? Just think about the hissing of arrows that, by the way, have this extra punching effect with, again, bronze heads that are going to be really felt on those shields and armor, and again, this reflects also the habit of the Scythians to engage against substantially armored enemies, which, again, as a people from the steppes, against some of the most advanced sedentary military cultures of the time, it's something you have to be at least equipped like, right? Again, most of the effect, as we've seen, is by creating the psychological effect, also scorched earth, anything that can weaken the enemy for contact, because again, just as a stopping power, the nomads do not have much, right? And you want to really really take everything from the enemy, as far as any as much as they can push you back and you're willing to, they're going to weaken themselves, and you can at some point hopefully take an advantage. Again, this is not really an indicator of strategic superiority. As a matter of fact, it's really not, right? But at the same time, and this is important, these peoples knew how to measure that limit, given their own habitual military background, in a much more, maybe not scientific, but surely accurate way, right? They had an idea of what it meant to wear an enemy out much better than, let's say, a Greek had, right? In general, right? Again, because they were habituated to different contexts, but when they met, surely they behaved like, even with the Persians, again, there is a big divide even between the Iranian sedentaries and the Iranian nomads, right? It's quite important to stress. And again, bronze heads cost, they are concentrated. Sure, there were multiple types of arrowheads for different targets, different distance, and so on. But in general, they knew how to cope with different types of targets efficiently. So in all this, as we hinted at before, the Scythians and the Maeotians were not only light archers, of course, and not just heavy knights as an alternative. They had javelins too, right? They were, generally speaking, habituated as individual herdsmen and cattle breeders and so on to handle different types of tools, right? Such as lassos for stopping, escaping cattle, things like that. But they would use that also against the enemy at a point. Not normally as people think, like winning battles by that, but say when you are hunting down an enemy or you surround them, you can use even a lasso to an important degree of efficiency. There were other things, not just lassos, there were also sticks with some kind of circles, whatever. But it's again that precision I was hinting at before. The Scythians, with their javelins, were able, apparently, to hit on a regular basis a loping hare at full gallop, as much as to pierce armor with those. Right, javelins are very effective against armor, especially in the joints. Again, they wouldn't fight in a context where there was lots of armor in absolute terms, but still, this is the point why anything would do, right? Against also more lightly or unarmored opponent in the first place. The Scythian offensive gear included a short, only 2 meters, let's say, and a long, around 3 meters, spear, battle axes, short and long daggers known as akinakes, famously enough, and also long swords with blades that range from 70 to 100 centimeters. There's a beautiful picture here from a Hellenic painting that shows you this massive kind of chopping blade, evidently that again in a mostly unarmored context would allow you easily to simply sever heads, cut people in half. It's really very easy, right? It only takes to make the blade pass through the vertebrae. Really, you can do pretty interesting stuff with those. So the different spear length corresponded to even their different type of targets. state, whether they were armored or unarmored, and whether you were, especially in that circumstance, armored or unarmored. These spears actually could be used also as some sort of static defense. You could fix them on the ground. As we'll see now, the Scythians did dismount to fight as well, so they would turn to be pretty useful. And also when I was talking about those infantries of the Maeotians, etc., you don't have to think something too different conceptually of how even some infantry spear walls could have been formed in these circumstances to keep the horses out, or at least to wound them significantly had they tried to break in. The battle axes and the Akinakis are definitely telling us a story of anti-armor weapons, right? They could be used, especially battle axes, in different ways, but the Akinakis there are pretty, that would be, in fact, that there are massive daggers, right? Some are smaller, right, but the thing is they're bulkier, and they're designed specifically for sticking them into the joints of armor, right, and to twist them and to penetrate further at close range. So this could be used by different types of troops, but it was really probably the if not the most favorite, but probably one of the most iconic Scythian weapons, and it was always there, right, showing us again that especially the elite against the other elite had to find weapons that during a sort of wrestling fight could be used at short range, right, because the swords are really, of course, important in these people's culture. They are the noblest of weapons. That's how they're becoming at this point in history, and they can surely chop how much you want it, so they cost a lot. They were mostly used by the nobility, but to obviously also strike armored opponents, etc. They had the capability in that regard, but you can easily understand, even if one of these armored warriors was surrounded by a swarm of lighter troops, right? Perhaps was not so easy to chase them. They could, in theory, but let's say there would be other circumstances, even on foot, as we've seen, or in other just daily life contexts, where feuds, as we've seen, were quite common, and people tendentially were unarmored at that point. You could, again, chop humans to pieces without too much trouble, right? It's a weapon with important range, with an important cutting capacity, but also some kind of trauma effect. So you can't really do without that. It's not, you can't just do that with an axe or with a lance. It's optimized for that specific use. Now, in battle, the Scythian volleys of arrows were followed, hopefully, by a charge with lances, which naturally was followed by a hand-to-hand combat, for which the bulk of the men-at-arms could fight mounted, but also dismounted. Right? There are some. This depends, of course, on the circumstance, but you understand that Scythians also had their own degree of fortification scattered here and there, mostly as bulwarks that were manned by, as we've seen, an itinerating force that they wouldn't just keep there to occupy, if not by obliging the local subjects to provide some sort of watch, etc. But again, storming enemy fortified rings to just spray the loot, etc., could entail, of course, these men acting as stormtroopers and having to fight on foot, right, in that circumstance. So this is also really a phase of the steppes, because the steppes are not just nomadic, right? There are some areas that, again, we are talking now mostly about the Pontic ones, but especially in Asia, there are plenty of places that are somehow not just more sedentary, but also fundamentally developed, also as in terms of technology. Some others are incredibly primitive and wild, maybe even at a short distance, right? But this depends on just on human settlement interaction. We can't generalize, we will see it better at some other point. Definitely most of the landscape is really the desolated steppe, where you have to orientate yourself with this kind of stones signaling positions, also some kind of sacred places, tombs of warriors, and I mean the intelligence and the practical capacity of the Scythian horsemen are hardly, can hardly be repeated, let's say. They had an atrociously advanced sense of orientation. They knew, generally speaking, just looking at the landscape, which was the best ground for what. Just first sight, were calculating also brutally this times of this stuff, like how much time do I have to move? Because if I get this wrong, I will get exterminated with the rest of my family. So the sapiential knowledge, the practical capacities of these peoples are unfortunately really lost. But you can just imagine knowing the herbs, knowing they had really some form of advanced medicine, especially considering the amount of bloodshed on which they relied habitually to leave themselves, and all the zootechnic, equestrian techniques, capacities, etc. The Scythians and the Maeotians had, as we've seen, an elaborate panoply, more than, as we've seen, the peoples of the first millennium, of the beginning of the first millennium BC, their forefathers, or the people that they had actually exterminated or subjugated by moving in the Pontic steppe. That's a part of what we were saying before. The world ages, right? Cavalry develops, the gear develops, and so on. The Iranian panoply at this point consisted of armor of different design, right? There were, for example, long-sleeved, short-sleeved, and sleeveless models. We see this long greaves. Some of the stuff was literally imported from, say, Greece, for example. We see short cuisses, which are something a bit more equestrian in nature. Abdominal and shoulder pieces, and semi-soft back pieces that are also something you need really more on horseback. Just think about the impact, right? Cavalry charges are carried out at something like 40-45 kilometers per hour. If you consider that you are just running into somebody else who's going at the same speed, it's as if you were to smash against a target at something like 80-90 kilometers per hour. It's brutal, right? But really brutal. And this armor was partly designed to absorb the shock and to hopefully, save your life, or reducing as much as possible the damage that, however, would necessarily have occurred at some point. And again, mostly stopping arrow fire, because most of the hits admittedly would arrive at pretty messed up angles that wouldn't be, also with the arrows being somehow spent at a given distance, etc. But again, considering the number of how many were shot, the risk was always there at any moment. Consider most of them went in this environment with their eyes uncovered, right? Their helmets normally were like that, and this naturally has to do with the importance of vision. So how dynamic this warfare really was, for leaving such critical parts of the face uncovered. So all the armor we listed could be made of leather, on which iron, or more rarely bronze scales were sewn. This depended naturally on the wealth of the individual, essentially the tactical role he had to perform. Surely these troops were employable in different ways, depending from their status during their lives and so on. Helmets in the 7th and 6th centuries were cast in bronze in the shape of rounded casques. This is interesting because it's a style you find even among other peoples around in the Balkans, etc. And seemingly this has to do with sort of the possibility of a pretty close hand-to-hand fighting, especially on horseback, right? So the idea of not creating anything that could be, say, hooked by some sort of laws or something that could hamper the movements, even just in wrestling and counter, that very often even mounted fighting could degenerate on from the same horseback. So this was done to minimize the impediments in a warfare that required a lot of agility. Right. At the same time, of course, the protection was substantial. Later helmets resembled scaled hats too. This design had also its own advantages, as especially for the lighter troops, could offer good protection with some less work, right? The skull cap and all the solidity that this required technically and so on. Many helmets, just as other armor, were purchased from the Greeks. And these were often remodeled after Scythian fashion themselves. So again, it was a lot of exchange between the Scythians and the Greeks, right? And they were all a bit fascinated with each other, right? There were some local deities that were imported from, say, Crimea to Greece. There were, again, this kind of mythological acquisitions from the Mediterranean. The Scythians got, but like comparing them with their myths that were basically actually part of the same identical religion, but that were, if anything, like a bit more refined stylistically in the Hellenic world. Not that the Scythians didn't have their own oral tradition, and also probably also a more beautiful one, honestly, if you at least get how all our languages are intertwined, and the more primitive you are, kind of the more original also the etymology, the semantics really gets. But unfortunately, we will never know about this. The armor of the Scythians also included a battle girdle / sword belt, often covered completely with sewn on narrow vertical iron or bronze plates. This was mostly to show off. It had, however, some importance defending the guy, and the same plate in the case of the scabbards, for example, were also that stylized in a way. That was, I mean, having the sword, having just the belt which to hang at, the scabbard, the baldric, was a huge deal. Is again the symbol of the cingulum militaris historically, and so the idea of knighthood definitely does pass through that as well. Very large girdles / corselets were in use, by the way. There are some greaves occasionally made of vertical bronze bands sewn to leather, or Hellenic forged cnemides, essentially mimicking the human shin and calf in Scythian use. all this armor could be very, very composed and then customized, right? It was important to protect the front, but steppes warfare, as we've seen, requires a bit an all-around protection, right? Especially in the abdomen. That is an area where even a minimal pierce can even get to wound significant places. This is true, generally speaking, for all the human body, right? But considering also how beefy these guys were, how at least side attacks, flank attacks were always nasty in some way, and could could cause wounds that, as you know, for the medicine of the time, were very, very dangerous. They could infect themselves easily. So protective gear included rectangular, oval, or lunate shield, right, that had different purposes. It wasn't very big, right, on horseback, and especially for the heavier troops, there wasn't need for anything, particularly large. Armor would do most of the work, and also the lighter troops, as we've seen, preferred to invest on speed and agility rather than protection, or at least that was their protection. These shields could be made of thick leather. They would apparently be often armored with iron strips or scales. This still indicated mostly an armored context that could be explained just for the fact that, again, archery was pretty nasty in that situation, and warfare was also a bit more individualistic than it would be later, because we don't find so much of heavier protection. Again, consider some of these shields were in fact used on foot, and you could somehow take advantage of this extra protection in quite ingenious ways. But surely the average Scythian wouldn't make great use of that, probably even in later times, when maybe just a pelta could be there, like a sort of lunate shield for the average Scythian axemen on foot still could be used, and most of those would be used as shock troops for, say, storming fortifications, etc., in a context that was going tendentially towards a sedentary direction. Shields and armor breastplates were decorated with golden images of beasts, or of their heads, hooves, and claws. This all speaks of, again, this mentality of transfiguration. The idea that, especially when you entered the military brotherhoods of these peoples, the war bands, you basically were entering at the lower grade through a test that was, in substantial amount of cases, mortal for he who tried, so that you were reborn into the lowest species, a sort of animal that would follow just as a pack the leader, that instead was just the most divine element. Could surely have a special connection with this or that deity, etc., but the general principle still meaning that there was a unique god, really, of which all the rest of the world was just an hypothesis. So, as I was saying before, there were surely chthonic dimensions to this that symbolized, again, the sacrifice, the idea of that this chthonic element had to be dominated, had to be made yours and controlled, so that you could transfigure it and being deified in the process. And for the lower ranks, for the lower, again, people in general, the idea of having being closer to this chthonic element that still was scary objectively, even for the most Uranian noblemen, was part of the game, was part of the organic system that the hierarchy in society really meant. Hellenic colonists brought with them from their native land Hellenic weapons, as we've seen, the xythos, the typical kind of more squeezed in at the base and kind of slightly larger blade width towards the top, right? Not a terrific weapon, but some of them were consistent enough. The Machaira, that was instead single-edged blade, essentially a large machete that we see, in fact, in the same Hellenic art represented for the Scythians, and that was an excellent weapon for mounted combat. Also, Xenophon describes it in its characteristics being quite effective in its sport physics for mounted combat as a sort of a scimitar of some sort, leaving these horrendous cuts, especially to unarmored opponents, but being also quite bulky at times to be a good anti-armor weapon by a degree. Then bronze helmets, armor, cuirasses, greaves, cnemides, also round shields covered with chased bronze were there, right? So in the Pontic steppes, the Greeks ourselves had to adapt their tactics to cope with the Iranian nomads. It's not much that they couldn't use their usual battle formation in the phalanx style, this kind of heavy infantry block, right? Just marching compactly in order to meet an enemy. You understand that would have had its limits in an open plain, like the steppes, differently from the kind of the more squeezed grounds of the Hellenic motherland between the mountains and the sea, sort of, at least conventional warfare where there was some degree of chivalry, at least for ideally involved. The phalanx needed protection, needed the flanks covered by cavalry. The Greeks would fight alongside other Scythians, again in their constant feuds, tribal feuds, and there are many instances. I described some of them in those videos about Scythian warfare, and some of them we will observe in other videos. But the idea is surely that the Greeks did field their phalanx, also large quantities of them, from their colonies in Taurica, and posing definitely a problem to the Scythians, and mostly had nothing to oppose to them frontally, if not trying to wearing them out before a charge. But again, that was basically the bulkier infantry to cope with, especially in order to crack with a shock. So everything had to be worked quite gradually. Surely the same Greeks adopted some sort of less rigid infantry formations. We have been habituated to think that Hellenic warfare and also political warfare was substantially just a fixed plot, right? In which that formation was used only in this rigid kind of immutable way. But telling the truth, a political warfare was always very varied in nature. The hoplites were still capable of engaging the enemy in broken terrain and storming fortifications. They were flexible enough. Surely by themselves they weren't, however, designed for that role specifically. You just take a pell test, right, with the right shot to take out a Spartan hoplite, especially if he's crossing some pass somewhere. So you can imagine what it means for a phalanx to be outflanked altogether, and surely there were such scenes. We've seen them even, I don't know, the Persians had some interesting character, mounted warfare. We've seen the Battle of Daskylion. Then there were war chariots involved, but this problem of covering the flanks was always there for the phalanx. The steppes is also not just complete flat land, right? And or at least where that is the case, usually there isn't much of a reason like to centralize to defend a place. Normally, again, also the Scythians would have their fortifications in the proximity of rivers, of coastland, of marshlands or whatever, forests, so on, ditches, palisades, etc. And I will make a video about Scytho-Hellenic warfare. What seems to have happened is that the average Scytho-Hellenic hoplite would fight with kind of a bit more of individualism, usually heavier gear, even compared to the Hellenic motherland. This cost a lot. Naturally, their number was more limited. But generally speaking, the need of protecting oneself from the arrows was pretty pungent, let's say, not surprisingly. And there would be lots of archers as well. Right? Imagine the equivalent of an hoplite, but equipped instead with a spear, or sometimes even with a bow and quiver instead, right? So that was an interesting solution because it kind of replicated an important amount of fire, missile power, let's say, that could be effectively coupled with the solidity of heavy infantry, and at that point with combined arms it would have been very difficult for a Scythian army to just kind of breaking the enemy frontally. They could annihilate each other, if anything. In any case, again, this depends on the asymmetry that regularly produces itself in warfare, where things can change in any circumstance. Consider, as we were saying before, that the Greeks in Taurica constantly enlisted local Scythian and Maeotian contingents, right, which led to an interaction of the Hellenic and the barbarian warcraft in this way. So they didn't lack mercenaries, they didn't lack lighter troops of different kind. It's even difficult to simply, stereotype what these armies could be, because really the concept of heavy infantry was present even in the Scythian world, as we've seen, especially with dismounted troops, dragoon-like, right? But the specialty, like the kind of the different arms at this point in classical warfare weren't dramatically differing from a people to another, right? So the main divide mostly being the Scythians being a mounted force, and the Greeks mostly having a foot one, right? So that's what makes the thing. There will really be a lot to talk about. As I said at the beginning of the video, we will have to get very thoroughly in the details of the technicalities, the tactics, the battles in Scythian history. For what we can get, because there aren't so many battles, telling the truth, that we can reconstruct. There are some interesting episodes, but it's mostly an awareness that we get from the entire, even just comparatively from other times and places in history, but where there were similarly the same nomads. But archaeologically speaking, we can look at some weapons and say, wait a minute, this weapon makes sense in this circumstance and this other, and so if there is some important degree of, statistical, say, evidence to make some sort of ratio, strengths, and so on, there is something more to say. So we will definitely look at that by some degree. For today, however, I stop it here. We will continue this series hopefully soon. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.